has so many different areas of interest and areas of curiosity here, and so I'm so glad that you invited folks to, because we've all heard one another now too, so you all know, at least in some small way, what's in the room. So let's see what we can make together.
Let's do it, and then afterwards, so we'll talk for a little bit, and then I'd love to hear your questions and thoughts and
definitely
ideas as well. I mean, one of the exciting things about this book and has just been hearing the different responses and getting responses from people and getting more and more examples, really. It's sort of everywhere you turn, there's a new example of this gesture, and hearing people bring their own examples to me has just been so wonderful. And in many ways, that's the way that this book was written. It was written out of so many conversations with colleagues and friends, and they would say, have you seen this work of art? Have you read this philosopher on this gesture? And I mean, even yesterday there was more, examples that, I wish I had had the chance to include it, but it kind of takes on a life of its own. And so that's been really wonderful to see. But it all starts with the cover, right? You encounter it on this jacket. And I think the designer, I haven't talked to him about why he chose a yellow color, and at first I was like, oh, yellow, but I think it catches your attention. It makes it such that you look at it, and then you're confronted with the sort of the topic, the gesture of looking away. And the image is taken from a print by Marc Antonio Raimondi after, I think, Raphael, depicting the scene, a moment in Virgil's Aeneid in which there's a plague. So it's a plague scene. It's a scene that has a tremendous contrast between light and dark. And in it, there's sort of, dead bodies. But even more than the dead bodies, what you notice are the various figures who are still alive and repulsed in various ways. And this is one of those figures in the scene who just cannot look at the surrounding, sort of the grotesque surrounds, and then there are others who sort of can't bear the spell. There's another who, a figure who's like turning away the head of a child who's grasping for their dead mother. I mean, it's a really difficult scene. But
so then that's fascinating to me, because it's a fragment itself of a much bigger scene. And one of the things I noticed again and again in this work is that there are major differences in and around the gestures and the mutual perceptions of what is and is not turning away. So covering one's face or looking askance, covering with an object or a cloth, and the extent to which it's voluntary and the extent to which it has any kind of morality associated with it, whether it is expected, even responsible or respectful, or whether it's actually entirely the opposite. And so I wanted to know about, especially because you're a literature and a language and all of that wonderful stuff person. I am a liturgy and a gesture and a ritual theologian person, but ultimately for me, it is always image and space first. It's just kind of how I see the world, how I experience things as a scholar and as a human. And so from a language point of view, what do you think the distinction is between turning away and leaving, or even walking away, exiting? Because turning away, it's like you're still there and yet you are no longer there, or there in a different way.
Right. Or being forced away, just to add another dimension, being forced or being displaced or being expelled. And there is so much variety of meaning and possibility around what these two words, turning away, are made to encompass in this book. And so maybe to kind of connect the dots between your two questions, I'll kind of share a secret, which is that I tried to, the original idea for the subtitle was Variations on an Ancient Gesture. And the reason I liked that was because it's a book that, it's not really just about turning away. It's not just about covering your face or closing your eyes or averting your gaze. It's about the ways that all of the kind of different varieties of a set of gestures interact to create different kinds of meaning, and the different kinds of meaning that are produced by even a sort of shared gesture, the hand over the face or something like that. And my editor, and I think he was ultimately right about this, wanted it to be more disciplinarily grounded, right? So it needed to have a kind of poetics or art or something that indicated where this book is situated beyond variations, which was too kind of, you wouldn't know where you're landing, right, when you pick up the book. And so that's why poetics is in the title, and it really does come back to my training as a literary person, right? As someone who's interested in language, and the book is also very interested in language and the variations on the terminology around turning away. Words like aversion, right? Avertere, and then all of the different, we have words like apostrophe, which is the same kind of construction, but out of Greek, apostrophein, to turn away, which I love talking about that word, but conversion, right, is another variation on this word of turning, but turning towards, and so that's
something that's in progress,
really,
that is happening, and yet also has a sort of almost like a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
When does one know that one has turned away?
Yeah.
Or like when is there a kind of a self-awareness of the turning away that is taking place in relationship between self and other, either on like a massive scale in terms of like the refusal to engage with certain kinds of major political or interpersonal situations, or something which is much, much more subtle. And is it possible, I would say it probably is, but is it possible to have an inner gesture of turning away which has no apparent physical consequence?
Yeah.
Like, if you're present with someone, you're spending time with them, and it is as though they have internally turned away, and yet there they are.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing I was thinking about a lot when the outer expression, when the physicality of something, whether or not it really does match. Which is one of those human things anyway, like the way that we present ourselves to one another, and often accidentally, is another sort of really interesting layer in this. I wonder if I can get us inside the book.
Yes.
Okay, let's get us inside the book.
I was just thinking, we're at a very high level kind of abstraction here, and it would be great to give you all a sense of the contours of the book, maybe, or we could go in so many directions.
And I mean, like, look at this, right? Like, I mean, I just stuck these in here randomly to make him think I read it. That's totally not true. I would love to talk about Mary.
Yeah.
Can we talk about Mary, the Mother of God?
Yeah.
And turning away.
Yeah.
And what I really want to do, so I'm kind of putting a pin in this to see how we can do this, if you choose to go with me, is to connect it to a photograph, which you spend some time with in the book as well, quite close to that section, which is by Shannon Stapleton.
Oh, yeah.
And it's an image which looks like a kind of an incidental, people are kind of moving by quite quickly, there's a blur, and then up against a wall in the background is a figure with a sort of battered cardboard sign. And the sign itself is speaking, asking for help, but the figure is in fact kind of crumpled and turned away and yet visible.
Yeah.
So, photograph. Let's think about that.
Okay.
But first, so there's the photograph. That's where I would like us to get to if you fancy this.
Yeah.
First, let's talk about Mary, the Mother of God, because in a way, to me, Mary is the ultimate one who says yes, who does not turn away, where God's like, I'm telling you something that makes no sense. And she's like, yep, I consent to the thing that makes no sense whatsoever. The whole of salvation will be contained within my womb and a human being who's also God, apparently. Let's do this thing. That's a terrible paraphrase of the first section of the Gospel of Luke, but it'll do for now, right? So the ultimate one who does not turn away.
Yeah.
And yet also the one who bears witness and cannot bear to look. And when you look at images of the crucifixion in relationship to motherhood and horror and her gestures in particular, what do you think of that? Yeah. So let's start with Mary as being someone who does a lot of different things.
You're diving right into, I think, my favorite chapter in the book, which is the 4th chapter. And
which I didn't know because we just met, so that's awesome.
You're getting right to the heart of it. And so maybe I'll start by just giving a sense of how the book is organized, and then we'll land in chapter 4 and think about Mary and others who are often represented turning away from the crucifixion, which gets at the complexity of this gesture, really, and the kind of ethical complexity of this gesture. So the book is organized around, there are 5 chapters. Each chapter starts with an ancient or medieval scene in which a figure turns away or covers their face. I use the metaphor of pebbles being tossed into a body of water. The pebble or the rock is the sort of ancient scene, and then it generates ripples outward. And so each chapter I throw one pebble in, and then the ripples by the end of the book, where like the ripples are not only refracting against one another, but they get further and further away from the rock, right? And by the time you get to the last chapter, we're talking about like Salvador Dalí and Rotimi Fani Coyote and all these figures that are very far from the last chapter. The
what
rock
even
is
a
about,
rock?
Yeah, what is a rock? But the last chapter, that rock is representations of Adam and Eve and the expulsion.
Which you call retroversion.
Retroversion, looking back, why we, what the way in which this gesture entails remorse or a kind of backward lookingness. But by the time we get to the end, the ripples are extensive and it's wild. But so each chapter starts with one of these ancient scenes and then ripples outward. And the 4th chapter, the scene, is the scene of the crucifixion. I can talk about our conversation, I'm sure, will take us into the other chapters, so you'll get a sense of what those rocks are as well. But what I found was that the crucifixion was said to take place, and at the moment of Christ, is it the moment of Christ's death or around the time of his death, darkness descended on the earth, a kind of eclipse. And so medieval artists had to represent this darkness. And how did they represent this darkness? They often depicted personified figures as the kind of sun and moon above Christ, covering their faces. And so this chapter is about the way that this gesture of covering one's face can be a kind of formal representation of darkness, atmospheric darkness, the darkness of grief, spiritual darkness and spiritual blindness. And what's interesting is that in representations of the crucifixion, it's not just the sun and the moon that are covering their faces. It's also sometimes Mary who is covering her face. Sometimes it's that she's weeping. Sometimes it's that she cannot bear to look. Oftentimes it's in contrast with John, who is on the other side, whose duty is to bear witness, to write the Gospel of John and to represent this. And so he's often sort of looking at the scene, at the crucifixion, wide-eyed, taking notes sometimes, writing in his scroll, while Mary is covering her face. Sometimes, though, he's covering his face too. And as a result, it's other figures around the crucifixion often cover their faces in really powerful ways. So if you go to, how many of you have been to the convent of San Marco in Florence? With all the Fra Angelicos, Al has, right? Sarah, is that Sarah back there? No? Right? So you have all these frescoes where the blood is sparkling with the metallic paint, and
they're in cells too. So
they're in cells,
the
so you're
space
living
where you
in your
live,
you're
and
living
it's
in the cell, and
one
you
thing per...
are meant to pay attention to this. But then you start to notice that Saint Dominic, that John, that other figures, Mary herself, are occasionally depicted just like covering their face, covering their eyes. And so I began to wonder, what does this mean? What are the kind of varieties of meaning here? Is this spiritual reflection? Is it proximity to the divine in a way that, or is it a representation of the impossibility of getting close to the divine, right? This is the moment at which Christ is at his most human, and yet there's this tradition which our mutual friend Nancy introduced me to, where at the moment of the ascension, which is when Christ really, you should correct me, but Christ becomes sort of true, like divine, and the sort of divinity of Christ is, the human sort of loses access to Christ as a fellow human, or there's some
Ooh, yeah,
right? Like, tell me about this, right? But
So,
artists would, how do you represent that? How do you represent the invisibility of the divine? While still depicting Christ's body?
Right? At the moment,
at that
almost
moment
the sort
of transition,
wild, the wild transcendence of presence and absence, where, I mean, like, sometimes it's really weird where you just get an almost like elevator with feet in a cloud and a bunch of people looking around going, whoa. Or in the case that you've got,
and that was an invention. That was like an artistic
Sure, because people have no idea what to do.
And then around the year 1000, they started going, well, you know what? If we put most of his body in clouds and put his feet dangling below, there we go. That
and artists were like, oh my gosh, great, donuts for everyone, take the rest of the day off. But then there's a huge problem with that, because it takes us right into the borderlands of the audacity of attempting to depict the divine at all. And so what I'm curious about when it comes to, what you've just been saying about the Ascension too. The Ascension, I suppose we could think about it like, I love the Ascension, I think it's amazing, because we could think about it as the culmination of that which has been accomplished between heaven and earth. And so it takes us into the idea of like the eternal quality of the Son of God as being, sometimes we talk about it like prevenience, right? As being like eternally present and yet bodily significantly present in this time, in this place, in this way. And when you were talking about different figures' reactions, and indeed the sun and the moon's reactions in these medieval images, it reminded me of one of the things that there are very few words from the cross that Jesus says while he's pinned to this wood. And one of the things that he says is to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he says to John, in the formation of a new iteration of chosen queer family in the most desperate of circumstances, really, "Behold your mother." And then the next line is, and then from that point on, John took Mary into his own home. So there's this tender formation of attentive mutual bearing witness, which then becomes this ongoing relationship, which is very distinctive and which is a sort of an enactment of Christ's commandment the night before in the Last Supper to love one another. And he's like, here's a demonstration of this. So there's a compassionate quality to it. But it starts with, behold. And often you'll see this too. There are images of crucifixions outside churches over many centuries, many different traditions. And one of the reasons why they're there are many. Often there are war memorials, things like that. But one of the reasons is that it activates this scriptural moment of, is it nothing to all you who pass by? And I wonder what you think about these gestures when they relate to refusal, where there's a kind of gestural, physical articulation of something being no big deal, as well as being the ultimate deal, unbearable, and yet there we are. So that's kind of taking me back to that photograph, which I'm evidently obsessed with, right? Is it nothing to all you who pass by? Because it would be a very different image if it is the man on the street still hunched over with this sign. But what the artist, what the photographer has chosen to do, it's photojournalism, maybe. I think it is.
I mean, it was
to have the people going back and forth.
Yeah, and you didn't mention that the first time in the foreground of this photograph, which is what struck me. And I encountered it in a NPR online article about.
God bless NPR. Don't take that away from us.
I know that some policies that the former mayor of New York was implementing that would allow police to basically forcibly remove unhoused from the streets on account of them, quote unquote, not having the capacity to make decisions for themselves due to mental illness in particular. And this was the photograph, this sort of Reuters photograph that happened to accompany that article. But it's striking because in the foreground there are these blurred figures who are clearly on their phones as they just walk by. And I think we all encounter this living in the city, especially on an almost daily basis. And so, what is the responsibility to?
We have all been those blurred figures. Some people, absolutely, and perhaps some people who are here, not making assumptions is one of the most precious things I think we can do to acknowledge and honor one another's humanity. may have been in the position of this figure as well.
Yes, yeah.
And you will not have to walk very far in order to enter into this territory in this time and in this place and in this postcode now. And so I'm curious about what's written on the sign here too.
Yeah.
Do you remember? It's like it's not a quiz.
Like
don't worry.
Homeless.
There it is.
It's like
a poem. It's extraordinary. Page 113.
Yeah.
If you want to read it, or I could read it. I don't really mind.
You can read it. Yeah, but I sort of took it up as poetry, really, and it's striking.
That's it. And to look at a photograph like that of city life and its persistent expectation of isolation and the sort of bearing witness to and yet avoiding disparity and lack of equity, and to connect it with Fra Angelico here is really cool. So just so we don't leave you in suspense about this. So he sits on a crate, he rests his head on a cardboard sign, so his head is on the sign, and the sign covers his face, and here's what it reads: "Homeless, I've lost everything but my hope for a better tomorrow. Please help. Thank you, and God bless." So the way I've just read it, it's line by line. Homeless, I've lost everything but my hope for a better tomorrow. Please help. Thank you, and God bless. It's convicting.
Yeah.
It truly is. I've lost everything but my hope for a better tomorrow. Yeah. If you've ever been in a situation yourself, anyone here, where you feel as though you have lost everything but your hope for a better tomorrow, then there is a particular kind of determination not to turn away, which tends to emerge in some of us anyway, from that struggle for the persistence of hope, and to live as though hope is not cheap, and it is also a kind of labor. Some would say that hope is a discipline rather than being inherent. Yeah. And so I wonder about hope and turning away.
I think that's one of the things that I think is so surprising about this photograph is that it, on the one hand, the figure with the sign is enacting a gesture of despair, a kind of traditional gesture of despair that goes back to the Middle Ages, to Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen describes despair in kind of precisely this posture of being collapsed over oneself. And yet, the sign, the poem, it reaches out and says the opposite, right? It says, I've lost everything except hope. And and then at the same time, it isolates the way in which the concept of turning away has become metaphorized, right? It's become a metaphor for what the figures in the foreground are doing as they walk by on their phones, as we walk by on our phones. That is not technically covering our eyes, it's not technically turning our bodies in the opposite direction, but we might say that it is a variation on looking away. And it depends on what we're looking at. It depends what we're looking at, because, and this gets back to the question you raised about the kind of the way that we encounter atrocity, because I think it's very easy today to justify looking on our phones as an act of paying attention, right? Of scrolling through as a way to sort of pay attention to what's happening in the world. I have a moral obligation to look and to notice, and yet here as we walk by, we miss the things around us. So no matter what, when you're turning one way, you're turning away from something. There's a kind of complexity around
So
that.
Towards and away are always linked.
But what I think in writing this book, the thing that surprised me most, the kind of thing that I just felt like I discovered and realized in looking at all of these different artworks, that I think the artists kind of recognized this, right? So it's not like a new thing. It's that oftentimes when we find ourselves turning away or unable to look, it is an indication to ourselves that we are encountering something that demands our attention, that demands our response, that demands our reflection, that demands action, perhaps. It's a signal to us that this is heavy, that this like we don't turn away when we're encountering something light, and so I began to kind of notice that figures like Mary, figures like John, figures like Dominic around the Crucifixion,
the sun and the moon themselves.
The sun and the moon, that they're performing this gesture not to distance themselves from that moment of suffering, but instead to make themselves, to grieve, right? To become more proximate, to feel the weight of that moment. And there's a dimension of this that has to do with our, like the temporality of this gesture, the way that it occurs in time, and that is that often when we turn away, we've already seen or at least anticipated the thing that we're turning away from. Right?
And to substitute what we've actually seen for what we see in our mind's eye, which is sometimes more devastating in some way.
Yeah, so sometimes to like say, I'm not going to look at this, and then we begin imagining what it is that we are not looking at and dwelling on it. And that kind of made me realize that actually oftentimes when we turn away, we can turn away on the one hand in indifference. I don't want to think about this, right? That seems to me very dangerous, right? And we're in a world with greater and greater indifference. I mean, the Pope made that sort of statement on Easter Sunday about indifference as a kind of an epidemic of indifference.
And that's not what this gesture is at all.
I don't
this
think
is
that.
a sort of intensity of pain.
Yes, the
opposite of indifference.
And I think and I think it's oftentimes what we do. It's we can even take a moment now. I like to invite audiences to
you're going to do it.
Yeah, take a moment. Cover your own eyes, right? I'm serious. Cover your eyes. Close your eyes. Think about what that feels like. Think about what kinds of circumstances prompt you to do that, make this gesture in ordinary life. And we do it all the time, and we do it often to think, and we do it to reflect on difficult problems. We do it when we're frustrated, or when we're stressed, or when we need grounding in relation to the world around us. And it's not, it might appear on the surface to be a gesture of disconnection or inattention, but oftentimes it like connects us. It connects us to ourselves, and therefore in the world, to the world around us.
And there's a wonderful and complex tradition in, say, late 19th century British and American painting of artists trying to depict people listening to music. And so what you'll get is a number of gestures that you would certainly recognize from your project and that we're really, thinking about now. And so being able to reduce the pressure of one sense in order to focus on another. And so what you'll get is a group of pictures where if you didn't know that the title was something like Songs Without Words or Listening to Chopin, they just look stressed. It's just like women being like, oh my goodness, but it's an intensification of concentration. And I wonder then too about, because there are so many ways of exploring this, and you also in your book you talk about images of blindfolded figures and the idea of justice is blind, the real complexity around anti-Semitic iconography and the way that has made its way in many, many dimensions into histories of Western European and in particular Christian art. And so I think it would be, if you'd like to, significant and meaningful in the context of this conversation to talk about where the blindfoldedness and the turning away comes from. I also, before I lose it, so maybe we'll do this first. I know I'm sort of lining things up.
You can say both, and then
I can say both. Well, let's see. I'm trying not to make your life too hard, but I also have mega ADHD, and it's the end of the day. I took some extra meds 2 hours ago so that I could organize myself. Let's see. Are they working? We don't know. Anyway, I know the answer is about a 6 out of 10. So anyway, the blindfolded thing. But the thing I want to do before that following on from what we've all just done together at your invitation, can you think of a time, because academics, we write things because we care about them. Mm-hmm. And often when we're participating in research and publication and pedagogy, we can almost lose track of the centeredness of our own humanity and the way that aspects of everyday life, but also frailty of just being a person in a world that is suffering, where we are part of that, and joyful, and we're part of that. Can you think of a time when you have turned away?
It's always a hard question to ask or to answer, because I do think that the times where we've turned away in a form where we should not have, right? Where we feel the weight of responsibility, they tend to stay with us, right? Don't. I think in those moments, we not only then remember the act of turning away, but then we remember the thing that we turned away from.
Yeah.
And so confessing this to you and to to an audience and whoever's listening. No, I remember.
You do not have to.
No. I remember quite recently. My mom is Catholic, and Christmas Mass is always a thing that if we're together, she insists that we do. And this past, I think it was this past Christmas, we went to a local Chicago church that we had never been to, and as we were walking in, there was a family who was asking for money or food, and I walked past, and as I sat down, minutes later, as I sat down, it sort of landed on me what I had done, and it's a kind of habitual thing that living in a city, you become accustomed to walking past, and it landed on me of what I had just done, and it was in that moment, I think, that the priest began by reflecting on using, in fact, the language of turning away from God, and how you all in the audience have not turned away from God by showing up here today. And I thought, just
wow.
the contrast between that wasn't, in fact, that I had just turned away, in fact, and was here listening to the priest sort of congratulating us for being present.
Wow. That's quite a thing, and that for what it's worth, and thank you, because it's personal and it's huge, and so one thing that makes me think about is that I spend a lot of time in pastoral conversations with people as a priest, where someone will come, and they may not know me at all, and they'll want to talk about things that have been really, really hard in their lives, maybe recently, maybe long ago, but that they sort of settle in them in a particular way. And one of the things that tends to happen again and again is that folks get really churned up about not having done enough, whatever that might mean, not having done enough. And one of the things that I come back to continually in this is that even Jesus, right? So there are so many stories, but one that occurs to me now with this is that he goes to a place, it's called the Pool of Siloam, right? Mm-hmm. So, and there are all of these people, they're not well. All of them are suffering. Mm. He goes, he talks to one guy, and often the way that particular gospel is interpreted is it's one of these transformative, miracle situations in that person's life, and there's a whole conversation back and forth where Jesus is like, what's wrong? And the guy is like, I try to get over here every day, but actually I don't manage to make it over here, and that's really frustrating because this is the thing that's going to heal me. And Jesus is like, well, maybe we could look at it a different way. And the guy kind of argues with him. It is a wonderful little human, frail, kind of a tense story. And then ultimately, no plot spoilers, plenty of plot spoilers, the guy gets up and walks away. And what was it like for everybody else who was sitting there that day being like, what, but that guy, and why not me? Yeah. And I think that's a huge, huge question. I think one of the best things that we have in terms of compassion and care and curiosity is awareness of the way that limits work in that. And one of the things that your book does again and again in a way that I really, really cherish, actually, it's one of the reasons why I want to use it in my communities, in my teaching as an art historian and in the work that I want to do. We were talking about doing a museum thing and the sorts of things you'd be curious about. So cool. But I want to preach about this. I want to do this thing with the community that I serve in St. James's Piccadilly and ask them, to... And one of the reasons why I want to do that is to help us to remember that it's not all down to us, and that there are moments where it is okay to not enter into the scariest thing, the hardest thing, the toughest thing. And there are also beautiful moments where the moment has passed and you think, and then that kind of recognition is something that can settle as wisdom. It doesn't have to settle as a kind of a horror or a sharpness, it may, but it can settle as a kind of a, wow, I cared about that. Why did I care about this? I care about that. I was like, that's interesting. And someone asked me a while ago about turning away and liturgical gesture.
Oh, wow.
And I've turned away constantly, and it's hard. There were moments where I read this book and I cried because I was remembering things about my own turning away experiences, for sure. But there's this thing that happens, and some of you will have seen the Eucharist, will have seen this thing before. So the priest is here, and then when you pick up part of the issue is that if the book that you're reading is over there, then the stuff is here, like the bread and the wine, the things that you have just consecrated are here, but the book is there. So I'm often very conscious of where my head is in relation to the rest of this stuff. And there are some, specifically in the Catholic tradition too, but we do it too sometimes as Anglicans, I do it, where for the words of institution, and what I mean by that is when Jesus says, this is my body, do this in memory of me, we tend to bend down a little bit. And I spoke to another priest about this the other day who was very irritated by this because she was just like, it just looks weird. You look like vultures. You're hovering over this stuff. You're doing this secret thing. What are you even doing? What's that about? And there's a tradition of the priest's breath, speaking the words of institution into the chalice as part of the thing. It's all very visceral and embodied. And I was really noticing that visual cue, which for some is a sign of attentiveness, of deep care. For others, it's just distracting and annoying and makes it look like something which is turned away from rather than towards. And now I get freaked out every time I'm about to do it. I think of my friend Maggie, also a priest, being like, don't do it, it looks weird. And I'm like, And so what looks right is also a really complicated thing.
And I feel the weight of having, confessed this. I've never told anyone about this before, and I think like, oh my God, what are you all think like?
I have that too right now. I'm feeling some vibes for sure.
But to take it back to the question of maybe listening, right? And you talked about the blindfold.
Yeah.
And
you remembered. Thank God.
I was like trying to hold on to it, and thinking about the varieties of meaning that are attributed to something like blind justice, right? This is a figure we've all seen, justice blindfolded on courthouses, where it's an emblem of impartiality and fairness. But the history of that blindfold started with the opposite, right? That it was blind justice, a kind of malicious indifference,
like a violent
lack of care, cruelty, and just as much now, it's kind of turned in an opposite direction, where it's about justice, the enaction of justice in unfair ways, right? Langston Hughes has this poem about justice, blind.
I wrote that down.
You wrote it down, yeah.
So it's page 158. There we are.
Amazing.
Yeah, so he publishes this in 1923.
That justice is a blind goddess is a thing to which we black are wise. her bandage hides 2 festering sores that once perhaps were eyes.
And you call that the goddess of the lynching culture. That is an incredible, that's you, yeah. This is the goddess of the lynching culture of the Jim Crow South. It is astonishing.
Yeah.
When you came across this, what was that like for you in your work and in your world to read this and to think about it in relation to the work that you're doing around image and turning away?
I mean, it really, it gives you a sense of the weight of attention, the responsibility of attention, the responsibility of attending to, and the ease with which these institutions can basically create structures that determine where attention goes or what justice turns out to be.
And who has done that violence and how that relates to the persistence of whiteness.
Yeah.
And that is...
And it ties
vital.
in, and so the you mentioned this earlier, but the history of that blind justice goes back to the history of representing synagoga and ecclesia, that is the sort of Jewish belief, Jewish Old Testament, and ecclesia, Christian belief. And those two figures were often personified as female figures next to Christ. Ecclesia, Christian belief, the New Testament, represented with clear eyes, holding a chalice, receiving the blood of Christ, and then next to her, synagoga, blindfolded, to represent the spiritual blindness of the Jews, that the Jews are unable to, and therefore unable to access the divinity of Christ, unable to understand him as God, and therefore responsible for this violence, right? So it's a kind of blindness as responsible for a mode of violence. And then it gets turned again by, I sort of investigate and think about these series of famous paintings by Marc Chagall in the 20th century, where he turned that, basically that representation of the gesture of covering one's eyes in the face of the crucifixion into a distinctly Jewish gesture, which some of you may know is a gesture that Jews make while saying the Shema, which is a prayer recited twice daily, but also at those moments just prior to a loved one's death. And you cover your eyes, and why do you, this goes back to what you all did in the audience, but you cover your eyes in order to listen to God. And this comes back to your question, I think, about the senses and sensation, which was really of interest to me. What is it about vision as opposed to hearing that's capable of being turned away, right? That's capable of being averted. And this is the third, I think, the third chapter in the book, but it takes as its rock this story from Augustine's Confessions, where Augustine is telling the story of his friend Alypius, who has been addicted to going to the gladiator games, and he eventually gives up this addiction until one day in Rome, his friends, after lunch, they drag him into the amphitheater, and they say, Alypius says, "You can drag me in, but you cannot make me look." And so he goes in, shutting his eyes, and he succeeds until the crowd, at one particularly gory moment, the crowd erupts and the sound enters his ears and provokes his curiosity, and he opens his eyes and then begins drinking up the gore and descends into the insanium of the circus, of the scene.
And Augustine in general is very thumbs down about curiosity, because curiosity and pleasure can unlock.
Curiosity gets
this,
in. You lose control. And he says, if only Alypius had been able to shut his ears as well. And so there's something about hearing, right? And again, this connects with the Shema. That's the word for to listen, right? The prayer is about listening. There's something about hearing that is less capable of being shut down, closed. Sound is more permeable.
And the thing about the Shema, too, is that it's a prayer of love.
Yeah.
So it's listen communally so that we are invited as a people, as well as in this moment, so particular as well as collective, to the unity of God and to the unity of the connection between God and neighbor and self. And that's astonishing.
Yeah.
I'm so curious about, I mean, we've talked about a whole lot of stuff. We've gone into lots of different places. Do you want to know what these people think?
I was just going to say, like, I want to listen. I want to take a moment to listen.
Curious.
Yeah.
If you'd like to share anything you'd like to share, we really want to know. And I wonder, so
we won't make you tell about a time where you turned away.
Absolutely not. And I'm aware that this is being recorded as well. It's not being live streamed, is it? No. And so I don't know how you feel about this, but especially for folks in the back, it may be difficult if you'd like to share for others in the front to be able to hear easily, or for us to be able to hear easily. So maybe a handheld mic if we can, or maybe just like, I don't know, stand up and be loud, or just be loud, you never stand. Oh, she got one?
I'll bring this, you can attach. I might ask one of you to.
Yeah, thank you.
I asked one of you to donate.
Oh, I see.
Oh yeah, I'll donate.
I only have 2 mics, so I'll run them back and forth if that's all right with you. Okay, cool.
Do you want to ask your question while you're on, and I can repeat it back to
What's the symbolism of the blind prophet?
the blind prophet? What's the symbolism of the blind prophet? I mean, in some ways, that it connects with the way that to connect it back to this gesture, right? Which is also one of the many things that it is used to represent is the capacity for vision. And to sort of have, for instance, if someone is having a spiritual vision, how do you represent that artistically, visually? You have them in a mode of covering their face. And so I think the sense is that by shutting down the senses, in particular sight, it gives you access to, it gives the blind prophet or the seer access to a different level, a sort of different spiritual plane. Or a different set of vision, right? So I think that's again the kind of magic of this gesture, is that it allows you to see it. Like, it seems like you're blind, but it actually allows you to see things. Yeah. What do you have thoughts on that? Or
Well, it makes me think a little bit about say St. John the Divine's revelation on Patmos, right? So that's where we get the book of Revelations from. And I'm curious always about that line, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And the idea of inner seeing being described as an authentic seeing, and then how that makes its way, not only with this example, but tons of examples, into visual art, where what you're looking at is a figure looking at a vision. And for us, perhaps, it's in a single image. And so it's very difficult to tell whether both those things are there, or whether one thing or one individual or one kind of visual story is a manifestation of the inner world of someone else's thing, the whole thing of which is a manifestation of a painter or whoever exploring their own vision, which is a whole extra layer of interpretation of something which, particularly when we're thinking about scripture, or certainly about imagery relating to God, relating to the depiction of Christ, can't be done. You can't paint God. It's always, it's always a wonderful failure, right? And I think that's such an interesting question, and I'm really glad about it, because the relationship between prophecy and apparent blindness, or looking away,
physical
or closing
blindness,
one's
right?
eyes.
A sort of physical shutting of the senses opens up the possibility for a different kind of what Augustine would talk about is a sort of inner sensation or spiritual senses, right, as opposed to the corporal senses or bodily senses. But also, like, I love language. We can maybe pass this around and I'll answer. I'll just say, like, the revelation, the Greek term, right, is apocalypse, which simply means, right, or literally an uncovering, right?
Yeah.
So it's a moment, when that is, at that moment, that is a moment where covering is no longer possible. Yeah. Right, where nothing will be covered anymore. Turning away, like, I don't know, like there's no more turning away at that moment. Yeah.
That the apple is like a.
Yeah. All right. Another question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. One of the images that is coming to mind as I'm thinking of the wild transcendence and the ascension of Christ and the inability to look at something so bright, it brings to mind this religious imagery from the Bhagavad Gita that I've been raised with, that was written probably between the 2nd and 5th century BCE. It's part of this epic poem, the Mahabharata, and the Bhagavad Gita is a poem in the middle of the poem that changes meter, and it's recorded as like the revelation of God, or a heard revelation of God. And there's Arjuna, this warrior who's in the middle of this apocalyptic battle between armies, and he's right on the frontier and is having an existential crisis. And Krishna, the deity that is depicting the divine, is guiding him as his charioteer through this apocalyptic battle. And at one point, Krishna grants Arjuna divine vision to see him for who he really is. And Arjuna is almost blinded by this unbearable radiance of what is called the Vishwarup, the cosmic manifestation, that it's this absolute non-dual, frightening representation of everythingness that is unbearable to look at. It's all that is good and all that is bad and all that is terrible in one kind of vision, and he can't see it, and he begs for this vision to be removed from him because he can't see it, even though he was begging before to kind of see the divine in all its glory. When it is revealed to him, he can't look at it. And I think in relation to that, my question or what I said earlier about Gaza, and when we are choose to look at or look away from the atrocities of the world, and what that means when we see it as the everythingness of the world, that choosing to look at the everythingness over all the discipline of hope. Sorry, I don't really have that much of a question, except for the fact that I guess how what you're speaking about relates to other traditions, in religious traditions in other parts of the world, maybe where there's this sense of non-dualism, where God isn't this other, but actually to look is to look at yourself. And I wonder when, there's these non-dual traditions from the East or South Asia or the Tantric traditions, how that relates to the gaze and the choice to look.
I think that, the first place that I would turn is other stories of creation, which, and I'll sort of talk about one that comes to mind before jumping immediately to Adam and Eve, which I think has elements that are similar, right? The first thing that comes to mind is this ancient Mayan creation myth called the Popol Vuh. Has anyone heard or read the Popol Vuh before?
Wow. When
do you
I
know
was
about this?
undergraduate,
Wow,
that's a
I
long time ago. Tell us.
I know about it partly because a good friend of mine teaches it and writes about it, Edgar Garcia, and then also as a result of that connection, we teach it in our undergraduate poetry curriculum. And this is a story of creation that has many continuities with the sort of Judeo-Christian story of creation, but it's also quite different. And so one of the things that happens as you make your way towards the end of the narrative is that you realize at the end that there's been this kind of back and forth. The gods are should we do this? They do it wrong. They make mistakes. They undo it. It's a dialogue. Rather than let there be light, then there's light. It's should we make light? What is light? It's this back and forth. And so by the time they finally succeed, they kind of go through several trials where they make humans out of wood, and it doesn't work. And basically what they're doing is they're trying to make humans in order to praise them as gods. And by the time you get to the end, you realize, it's been dark and muddy this whole time, and damp. And then they finally make humans out of maize, out of corn, and it succeeds, and they suddenly can see and it's they see everything. And the gods are whoa, actually we need to put some shadows over your eye. Like we can't, like you can't see everything. So I think there's a lot of, the point of bringing this up, there's a lot of traditions where in the way that we think about ourselves as humans and how we came about, part of the question that these stories try and address is exactly this, is like how did we come about with this kind of limited capacity to see, and what would it be like to just constantly have our eyes open to everything all at once, and how impossible and unbearable and how unlivable that would be. And that seems entwined in all of these creation stories. And for Adam and Eve, it's similar, right? They eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and in doing so, they gain all of this knowledge. And my reading of that is that suddenly with that, they need to find a way to turn away, to cover their eyes in certain cases. And this comes out of, it was kind of what started this book for me, was coming across these images of Adam and Eve in a medieval manuscript that I just had the chance to look at Oxford. It's an amazing manuscript from about the year 1000 containing an Old English poetic translation of the book of Genesis, and it's heavily illustrated, and it's a weird translation of Genesis because in it,
so that people can take a look for themselves online. What's the manuscript called?
It's called the Junius manuscript.
There we go.
And it is
illustrations
awesome.
are brilliant. It's awesome, but it's also really weird because it's not, Satan doesn't approach Eve as a serpent saying you should eat this fruit, you're going to be like a god. No, he comes disguised as a messenger of God and says God wants you to eat this fruit. And so Eve eats the fruit thinking that God wants her to eat the fruit. So is that disobedience? Yeah, it's like, what's happening here? Yeah. Anyways, it's this incredible text, but in it, Adam and Eve are making this gesture over and over and over again, facing one another, covering their eyes, and it occurred to me that it's precisely a gesture not only of shame, but it's also a gesture of anticipatory grief. They're going to become mortal and therefore die and therefore need to grieve. But also that, like, suddenly with all this knowledge, their eyes are opened, and you need a way to shut and manage that so that you can pay attention to the things that matter, or that you can confront, I think. Yeah.
I think that quality of overwhelm plus attentiveness to limitation, and how the explication of that in itself gives rise to stories of like unimaginable impossibility, and yet those stories become rooted in language, in practice, in holiness across so many different dimensions. And that sort of made me think in response to what you've shared, and also in response to what you've shared. So this is nice. There's a short poem by a guy called George Herbert. Do you know what I'm talking about? 17th centuries. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So
I'm going to read this poem.
Shout out to Richard Stryer.
Right.
Do you know Richard Stryer?
Yes.
Renaissance scholar, colleague of mine, emeritus professor. And he kept, while I was writing this book, he kept telling me, like, you have to write about this poem. You have to write about this poem.
Yeah.
And I didn't. And when he
he
got the book and he sent me an email and was like,
he's like, Ben, buddy,
why didn't you write about this poem? Like, that was like, so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's bring it in. And one of my favorite George Herbert scholars is a guy called Marc Oakley, who's he's also a priest. He's the dean of Southwark Cathedral, and he's also a gay activist. And so for him, poetry and queerness and love and belonging are really crucial. So here is this 17th century poem by George Herbert. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve.
You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. I think it's so interesting that this has been kind of present and yet not present in the project. So I'm sure that there's lots of stuff to reflect on there.
I don't know how, I don't have a grasp on the poem. Like, I think that's why I couldn't, I like to be able to work my way to some kind of understanding, and I just have struggled with that poem. So
I love the struggle.
Yeah.
I think
that's
I
why
think
we
in
read
lots of
poetry,
ways,
right? It's like,
Yeah.
it's to experience that struggle, and it's ongoing, and
Yeah.
and even once you think you've landed on the poem's meaning, then you pick it up again and find something else.
And that's the case
Yeah.
with any project too,
Yeah.
where it's like, I love that the French word essay is attempt, and that's where we get the word essay from. And every time I feel like I can't write, I draw incredible comfort from that, where it's like, let's try it out.
Yeah.
Let's see,
How much time do we have? How are we? Do we have time for one question? Okay. Yeah, maybe one more. Yeah.
I'll come to and then.
I love it. Yeah.
So, my apologies, I was slightly late, so apologies if you covered this earlier, but I was wondering about looking away as a form of, granting dignity, rather than as a form of, not paying attention or focusing attention inward, or, turning away from overwhelming sancticity, from, turning away from something that somebody wants you to turn away from, for their own dignity.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You've landed on another kind of, I think, quality of this gesture, which is granting dignity, granting respect. Respect is a very interesting word. It means to see again, and so which is strange, but it's. But I do think that oftentimes, and the place, I guess, where the most kind of obvious place where we, I think, do this is in encounters with the naked body, where we're both inclined to look, and obviously we're deeply attracted to naked bodies, but also there's a sense of I shouldn't be looking at this, and therefore I become. So I learned yesterday about an exhibit where I can't remember who the artist was, but she had situated as part of the exhibit two people standing naked in a walkway that the visitors to the exhibit had to walk through, and just seeing everyone's response as they
I think that's Marina Abramovich.
Is that who it is? Yeah,
I think so.
Okay, yeah. Is that ongoing? Is it? Yeah, I'm trying to think. Anyways. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there, that I think is a perfect example of how we relate to the human body, and why we might
and confronting
perform this
our own
gesture.
tendency towards voyeurism,
Right,
and where
right.
the ethics are around that. Staring is a form of harassment, right?
Right.
So,
and this in some ways again goes back to, I think, the story of Adam and Eve, and the sort of that story is about suddenly they recognize their nakedness, and their nakedness in a sexualized way, in a way that should be covered, and therefore clothing, therefore fig leaves, but also this gesture of respect, mixed with a little shame. Yeah.
Cole Arthur Riley, who's a wonderful writer in autobiography and Black liberation theology and spirituality, talks about that moment in Eden where one of the outcomes, if not consequences, of that whole scenario, if I can put it that way, is that God then tenderly becomes kind of the first fashion designer in making clothing that attends to the body, because God has, in that sense, it's not about God's shame. Nothing is hidden from God. It's about their shame in relation to one another, and the way that ends up sort of ricocheting around, and the complexity of the boomerang effect of not knowing where and how one's dignity can be respected and protected. I really, really love where that question has come from. I think it's so important.
One more? Is that, yeah?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, I think, because so many of the examples have this dual nature, being both either deferential or denying. I was going to offer a potential reflection or answer to your question of like, why seeing? Why do we think about it in that way? I mean, there's a practical element to which you can't shut off your ears or your nose in the same way, but that's kind of probably looking at the opposite way. Why can't you? Why is it important for us to be able to shut our eyes? And just neurocognitively, our brains are dominated by the visual system, that they occupy more processing than almost anything else we do. And yet they're also very fragile or almost deceptive in themselves. We perceive the visual world as this kind of complete field. It looks like one thing, but we know that that's an illusion of sorts. Like our actual aperture of attention is so small that we can kind of think we're perceiving something, but actually we're not looking at it at all. Yeah. And so the very kind of I feel like this gives rise to the very possibility of turning away, of not seeing something but knowing it's there. Yeah. And kind of, in some sense, the thing I'm walking away from your talk is the idea that it can mean either a good thing or a bad thing, but in any way there is power in it. Yeah. You know, because you can, you're both seeing and not seeing.
Yeah, Augustine recognized this. He described, and we've, once I explain this, you'll sort of say, oh, of course, that's how I encounter something like a three-dimensional sculpture. In order to see it, you see it from one angle, and then you move to a different angle, and you remember what you saw from the other angle, or you anticipate what you will see. And so you're never fully seeing all angles onto the sculpture at a given time, but instead you have to call up your memory and you have to call up your imagination to kind of fill in those gaps. And it requires changing your orientation in relation to that object.
Orientation and relation in this question about seeing and about vision is something I've been thinking about throughout this conversation, and while I was reading this too, because there's a difference between turning away and looking away, and the embodiment of shifting and shifting a gesture. So it's a bodily thing, which is often more than shutting one's eyes, right? If we come back full circle, if you like, to this wonderful and, I see so much in this figure, and I'm so glad that this is the one that's in the book, because this is a very, very different thing in terms of turning away, where you have the hand, you have the motion, you've got this curve of the self where the eyes are closed. But that's only one part of the whole somatic story, I suppose.
And I'll maybe end by reflecting on the kind of inherent ambivalence in this gesture. That is the kind of bidirectionality that and the way I think about this comes out of Plato's anecdote of Leontius, who is walking along one day and sees a pile of corpses and notices them, but then turns away and then covers his face as he struggles with himself, and then eventually he gives in and condemns his own eyes, and he says, take your fill of this beautiful sight, right? He can't, and we don't, like, there's no kind of ethical claim there. Plato's not Socrates in this moment is not bringing it up to say, like, oh, he's doing something wrong, or he's doing something right, or he's performing the right thing. It's merely about the inner conflict of the soul as we get pulled in different directions at the same time. And it's this gesture, right, that performs it's not just a kind of unidirectional pulling away. It's also the gesture that he makes while engaging in that inner conflict. It's the gesture that we perform when we struggle with confronting something that is provoking us to turn away, and even as we turn back to it, or turn back to it too late. We're always too late, right? And that moment in the church, by the time we left and I had sort of processed it all, the family had already gone, and so it's that too lateness, I think, is is so much a part of our lives, especially in this ever more hurried time.
That really that really encourages me to settle in a space of deep and, I hope, expanding compassion.
Yeah.
To have compassion on moments and on people where turning away is what has happened, and to have patience with human limitation where that's a tendency, so that perhaps we can address it, to not turn away next time, and to understand why we do or why we don't. And I'm just so grateful that this has been possible, that we can do this together.
I'm likewise so grateful, and that togetherness. The word compassion is suffering with, right? It's not looking at. It's not sort of passively gazing. It's suffering with someone, or being with someone. And so Anyways, this hasn't been an instance of suffering. On the contrary, it's just been such a pleasure to
and we met.
To be in.
We met 2 hours and 7 minutes ago, and
oh my gosh.
This is what we made with all of you. And this is a really precious space, so deep honor and care for each and every one of you. It's possible, too, that topics like this bring up some stuff for people, and so please, look after yourselves. And if you find that stuff is starting to churn away at you, please find the support that you need. This is not just an abstract intellectual thing. This is about real people and real experience.
And thank you, Al and Housmans, for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
And thank you for writing this book.